How to interview someone for their business and life stories. This is one of those trending questions I get as more people are starting their podcasts, their YouTube channels, trying to stand out amongst the noise. How do you ask good questions? How do you get the guests to tell you good stories? Really utilize their expertise and share something actionable with your audience. So today I'll share with you some of the tricks you can use to immediately stand out, show that your interviews are different, and make it really engaging and captivating and useful for your audience. So let's get started. Just a sidebar, I won't talk about the basics like you have to research the other person, find out their background, their interests, so that you can have a more interesting conversation. If you're interested in that, let me know in the comments. I'll do a different video. But this one's really about how do you get the other person to tell stories that are interesting and useful for your audience? And how do you stand out and increase the quality of your interviews? So, okay, with that in mind, let's start. First, let's talk about how to ask good questions. What questions should you ask to increase the quality and make the interview interesting? So here, even when I was back in management consulting, we always created interview guides and we did drafts after drafts, trying to get to the right question, the right wording, so that the interviewee will give you interesting and useful answers. And here, the focus you want to put on is their decision-making process. Why did you decide to do X, Y, Z? This will immediately set you apart from most of the interviews out there. Why? Because most people are interested in what happened. That's a very passive way of someone telling the story. This happened, that happened, so I did this, and then this happened, that happened, right? It's all very passive. But if you think from the interviewee, the guest's point of view, they go through life making decisions, right? I chose to do this, and then these things happened, and I chose to do something else, and then more things unfolded, right? And that's a very exciting way of telling the story for the guests, as well as for the listeners to hear the story of, the hero walking through life, making difficult decisions, and then maybe seeing some failures, which are interesting because then they make more decisions to correct their path, or they've made decisions after decisions that led to their success, which we can all learn from. Because here is the key, is that our lives depend on the decisions that we make. So we want to get to how did this person make their decision? Because what makes them special is not just, they're intelligent or they worked hard, but rather the decisions that they've made.
So basically you're in college and you're starting to amass this following of people who want to connect with you and watch you play. And you realize that you can't actually be a college student and also a streamer because you're devoting so much of your time streaming.
Well, actually, it was just that as the years go on, obviously in an engineering degree, the classes are bound to get more difficult and more time consuming. So I just knew I quite physically would not be able to maintain a streaming schedule as well as go to all my classes and pass all my classes.
Yeah.
Luckily, this kind of coincided with a time where streaming, well, I had always seen it as a really fun hobby and something that I could make a bit of, side hustle money through. But I didn't really look at it as a full-blown career because I wasn't making much money off of it. But around that time, sponsors and companies started entering the space and they started sponsoring streamers like me. So for example, they would just say, okay, for $2,000 a month, you just need to put our company logo and branding on your stream. You need to use these products this many amount of times. And yeah, more and more companies started entering the space in this capacity. And I started getting some of these deals and realizing, wait, this is something that I could maybe someday turn into a full-fledged career.
If you want to get more advanced with this, think about decision-making in terms of heuristics and cognitive biases. So we make 35,000, 40,000 decisions a day. And in neuroscience, behavioral economics, psychology, They talk about these shortcuts, these heuristics, and the biases that we have in order to make quick decisions, right? If you've seen Thinking Fast and Slow, System 1 versus System 2 thinking, a lot of our decision making happens in System 1, the quick emotional decision making process. So if you have a few of these basic ones in mind, like the Dunning-Kruger effect, that we usually are quite full of ourselves and overestimate our intelligence, our capabilities, or confirmation bias. Like we usually, once we have a hypothesis, look for information that confirms it rather than contradicts it. With these little shortcuts, biases in mind, we can then ask really good why questions.
We do that in the workplace too. And I notice this with policies and procedures, right? Procedures are basically like an algorithm that you apply given a certain situation, certain inputs. And what I discovered is that it just eliminated thinking. Because people would go, oh, there's no procedure for the slight deviation from what would happen. And I can't respond because at first you can, but you lose that ability over time to actually apply judgment. Well, maybe I shouldn't apply this procedure in this particular case, and I have to do something different. And that's where this teaching thinking and teaching judgment sort of comes in. And I find that when we get into organizations, we actually reinforce this modeled, siloed, predictable way of solving problems.
Absolutely. And if we want to go on this vector, it gets even worse than what you've described. Right?
Oh, go on.
which is we dramatically, vastly overuse science. So what you were taught in business school, and you tell me if I'm wrong on this, is that a good business man or woman, businessman in your case, if you're going to be a good businessman, Shane, you will make decisions based on analysis.
Yeah.
Right? You'll do the analysis and make a decision. You're some kind of a corporate floozy if you're just going making decisions without the analysis behind it. So you can ask the question, where does analysis come from? And the answer is from Aristotle. For 2,400 years ago, 4th century BC, Aristotle essentially created science. So the guy who invented science, though, pointed out something about science. He said, science, this methodology I've used, is for the part of the world where things cannot be other than they are. So what does he mean by that? Well, if I let go of this pen, what'll happen? It'll fall.
Yeah.
If I let go of this pen 10 years from now, what's going to happen? It's going to fall. If I let go of this pen in Antarctica, it's going to fall. That's the part of the world where things cannot be other than they are. But the guy who invented science warned, he said, but there's another part of the world. There's another part of the world, and that part of the world is the part of the world where things can be other than they are. Right? Think about these, right? In 1998, did you have one of these within one arm's length of you and you started to get hives if it was more than one arm length away? No, because it didn't exist. The first one existed in 1999. And everything about human life is different now because of that thing. That's the part of the world, humans interacting where things can be other than they are. And you know what Aristotle said? The guy who invented science said about that part of the world? Do not use the scientific method. Why would he say that? Well, if you use the scientific method to understand how people interact with technology, right, you will demonstrate to yourself that this could never exist, right? Because you've crunched all the data. How much do people use smartphones? Not at all. Right? Because they don't exist, right? You'll predict that. You'll predict that it'll continue to be, and you'll be like, Nokia and think that feature phones will rule forever. But the guy who invented science said, don't do that. And what he said is, in that part of the world, the job of rigorous thinking is to imagine possibilities and choose the one for which the most compelling argument can be made.
With these heuristics and biases, you can ask really good follow-up questions to your initial question about how did they make that decision-making process, and use that to show your audience that this person thought about things in a different way, in a new way, which makes the interview really interesting. I'll leave a list of cognitive biases and heuristics in the description below. And the idea really is to ask about how did you make your decisions, ask them about the processes, and then follow up with why. Why did you think differently from someone else? And that's where the heuristics and the biases come in. So that's the first part about asking good questions around their decision-making process. The other benefit of focusing on decision-making is that not only does it help draw out insights about what makes this person special, why did they succeed, why did they fail, how did they get out of it, but also that it helps your guest tell their story in a very focused way. So they don't ramble on, and instead they can give you a story that gives you context about their decision-making process, which makes it very captivating for the people who are listening to it or watching your interview. Now, they will already be giving you the context of what was happening. They might be giving you examples. But here, the second thing is to look out for opportunities to get specific. And specifically, you want actionable steps that your audience can take immediately and do something with it. So, for example,
for the new entrepreneurs that are just getting started out there, what's one piece of advice that you would always recommend to an entrepreneur, something that you've learned over the years that they can take with them in their new venture, and then something you'd completely avoid, like something that you really screwed up on that you'd never do again?
Okay, sure. So I think in terms of advice, I think it's very important to seek out, to actively seek out and listen very carefully to negative feedback. And this is something that people tend to avoid because it's painful.
Yeah.
But I think this is a very common mistake, is to not actively seek out and listen to negative feedback.
Where do you do that? Do you go into forums? Do you go into Twitter? Like, what are your areas where you go to look for feedback on, let's say, the Tesla?
Well, it's like everyone I talk to is, in fact, when friends get a product, I say, look, don't tell me what you like, tell me what you don't like.
Right.
And then I think it's also important to reason from first principles rather than by analogy. First principles is kind of a physics way of looking at the world. And what that really means is you kind of boil things down to the most fundamental truths and say, okay, what are we sure is true or as sure as possible is true? And then reason up from there. That takes a lot more mental energy.
Give me an example of that. Like, what's one thing that you've done that on that you feel has worked for you?
Sure. So somebody could say, in fact people do, that battery packs are really expensive and that's just the way they'll always be because that's the way they've been in the past. You're like, well, no, that's pretty dumb, because if you applied that reasoning to anything new, then you wouldn't be able to ever get to that new thing.
Right.
And for batteries, they would say, oh, it's going to cost, historically it's cost $600 per kilowatt hour, and so it's not going to be much better than that in the future. And you say, no, okay, well, what are the batteries made of? So first principles would be to say, okay, what are the material constituents of the batteries? What is the spot market value of the material constituents? So you can say, okay, it's got cobalt, nickel, aluminum, carbon, and some polymers for separation, and a steel can. So break that down on a material basis and say, okay, what if we bought that in the London Metal Exchange, what would each of those things cost? Like, oh, geez, it's like $80 per kilowatt hour. So clearly, you just need to think of clever ways to take those materials and combine them into the shape of a battery cell, and you can have batteries that are much, much cheaper than anyone realizes.
Now, once you have the questions you want to ask, right, focused around decision making, then you even have follow-up questions to ask, which is around, why did you decide to do something that other people aren't doing? Then you also get specific actionable steps out for your audience to use immediately. You also want to think about, how do I transition between each of the ideas? Here, you really want to think about the interviewee, the guest again, right? Think about life through their point of view. They've had significant moments, pivotal moments in their lives, and that's led them to who they are today. So you want to use one pivotal moment to move on to the next, to get them to tell the story of how did you go from here to there, right? Which decisions led you to the next part of your life? And one simple way of doing this is just asking them.
So fast forward a little bit, you obviously did PayPal. That was very successful. And then at some point in time, you're like, I'm going to do something crazy, something that's never been done before with Tesla and the space-related stuff that you're into. I mean, why take on such huge, very ambitious type projects? I mean, did you ever have a feeling like this might not work?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, so this kind of goes back to college, where I was trying to figure out what are the things that would most affect the future of humanity, and the things that I thought would most affect the future would be with the internet, sustainable energy, which is both production and consumption, and so effectively solar cities like production, Tesla's consumption in a sustainable way, and then also space exploration and specifically making life multiplanetary. Now, I didn't expect at the time to be involved in all of those areas, but those are just the areas that I thought would most affect the future. And as it turned out, I've been fortunate enough to be involved in those areas. Mm-hmm. But that's the thread that connects them. It's kind of my best guess at what would most likely affect the future in the biggest way.
Now, the other way of transitioning is using your own experience to respond to the guest and then asking a question about something else.
But you recently did a Facebook Live. You did one yesterday, and I watched it. And I just thought it was so wonderful because I was looking through the comments, and I loved seeing, where there were places where people were taking issue with a particular word or a particular phrase. And there were so many people that were coming in and saying, hey, I'd actually love to discuss this with you. You can PM me, but there was a quality in the intention of that that did not feel accusatory. It felt like an invitation. It felt like, hey, I want to share a viewpoint with you that you may not have considered before. And it almost brought tears to my eyes because I've seen so little of that.
It's amazing. It was amazing,
it
right?
Was amazing.
And we're talking about 10,000 comments.
Yes.
But here's the thing, that's hard fought. We don't curate the comments, but we police them. And I'm very clear about that.
Can you talk about that distinction? Because I think, especially in our audience, and I know, you and I have so many friends in this space, people who are authors, people who lead companies, people who have the privilege of having an audience. Yeah. And I think they would love to hear from you. That's why I'm asking these questions, to have tools, because a lot of folks are like, I want my so-and-so who I admire to speak out. And I think what you said is so key here, that you've been studying this for 10 years and you walk into these conversations still feeling really nervous.
Oh my God. Oh, completely vulnerable. In fact, when I taped that Facebook Live on Charlottesville, my voice was shaking for the first 10 minutes of it. Like, I didn't know if I was going to be able to make it all the way through.
I didn't notice that, just so you know.
Yeah, no. And it was a full scheduled taping day of other things. And it was scheduled to be taped in the afternoon. I said, as soon as I got there in the morning, I said, I have to do this now because it's so heavy on my heart. Yeah. And I'm so afraid that if I give myself time, I'll rationalize myself out of doing it. Yeah. So for me, it's about this. This is my space on Facebook. You can have everybody can have their own space. In my space, you can disagree, we can debate, we can argue, but you're not going to shame other people. You're not going to name call, and you're not going to put people down. If you do, I'm probably going to ask you once not to do it, and then you will ban you from the page. And I do not think there are enough spaces in the world right now. There are some people who do it really well. TED does it really well because it's kind of, comments are moderated, I guess is the right word, by the people who comment there, the community. So they'll vote you off the island, I guess, if it's too inappropriate. But I'm not going to tolerate that because it doesn't contribute.
Yes. The misconception is that you need to know as much as possible in order to have an intelligent and interesting conversation with someone else. But the idea is that the other person is the expert. The other person is the point of interest. It's their life and their research and their intelligence, whatever it is. So you want to draw out what they have spent months, years, decades understanding, right? That is the point. So instead of not asking questions, hoping that people will think that you also know what they're talking about, your value add is to ask questions that your audience also have in their mind when they're listening to this. How does that apply to my life? How does this apply to my daily situations? Let me know in the comments below. Who do you want to interview? What do you want to talk about? Like this video if you found it helpful. Subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.